Ghost Horror Story, The Ghost of the Sea. Author, B.B. Unique. Koto Island, the second day of the 7th month, the year 1989. Storm. The storm is so big. The sky was split in half by a bright flash of lightning, accompanied by a dry sound of thunder resounding in the sky. The storm came late in the afternoon, bringing with it wind and rain. In this island area, every storm is very fierce. The wind whistled intermittently, the wind blew against the wall in pop waves. It sounded like someone was throwing lumps of dirt against the wall. In the level 4 dormitory house allocated by the factory, Mr. Kim, then a 25-year-old man, sat huddled in a corner of the bed, wrapped in a peacock blanket, holding a package of instant noodles in his hand, chewing heavily. Each piece. It's been 1 month since he left the island under the labor-enhancing policy, but young Kim still can't stop missing home and his lover who is studying at Pedagogical University in the capital. Tonight there is a storm, a big storm, the first time since leaving Kim Island that I have witnessed a sea storm. In the level 4 house, half of the house was leaking, and the wind was blowing so hard that Mr. Kim couldn't help but shiver. The rain fell heavily on the roof like someone was throwing stones. It had been raining since the afternoon. Kim had to use all the buckets and pots in the house to catch some of the rainwater. The flickering light of the oil lamp covered the small room with a strange, faint light. Trying to finish the package of instant noodles to fight hunger, Mr. Kim decided to wait for the rain to stop and then immediately run to the beach to see if the baskets and boats were still enough. In the afternoon, the whole factory worked very hard to tie up the fishing boats. The fish, the nets, but this big storm might blow all the nets out to sea. Sitting alone in her room, Kim suddenly remembered her family, her elderly mother and her 2 little sisters at home. My father passed away early, and my mother had to single-handedly support the whole family. Then Kim remembered Van, a lovely girlfriend near home who was studying at Pedagogical University. Having been together since childhood, we already had feelings for each other, but our love on the inside was like the outside, but I'm afraid. It wasn't until they received the decision to go to the island that Kim dared to muster up the courage to confess her love to Van. She also promised to come visit me sometime. Thinking of her loved ones, Kim sighed and suddenly felt sad. Suddenly, the wind blew open the window, blew out the flickering oil lamp, pulling Kim out of her thoughts. Afraid that the rain outside would wet the house, Kim crawled up to close the window. While struggling to pull the door, Kim suddenly looked into the distance. The row of casuarinas in front of the house is bending with the wind, seemingly breaking at any time. But under the casuarina cave, hidden behind a bush of wild reeds, Kim saw a silhouette of a girl wearing a white shirt with long hair standing silently looking out to sea. Wondering who would stand alone in the heavy rain, Kim called out, "Hey miss." But that girl didn't come back. Suddenly a strong wind blew into the room, sand dust flew into his eyes. Mr. Kim staggered and let go of the door bars to rub his eyes. Suddenly, a strange cold feeling ran down her spine. Kim turned around, her eyes still blurred by dust, just vaguely seeing a pale white color in the corner of the room. Before she could figure out what it was, Kim rubbed her eyes a few times, but when she could see there was nothing, the room was still a dim dark color. Turning back to the window to close the door, Kim could no longer see the girl from before. Then he fumbled in the dark to light the oil lamp again, but it took him a while to light it. As soon as the light flashed, Kim widened her eyes and jumped back. On the wall, where the faint white shadow from before was a very clear hand-shaped wet mark, as if someone had just stuck their hand on the wall. But why is there anyone else here? This row of dormitories has 4 rooms. One room at the beginning of the row belongs to Kim, 2 rooms in the middle are empty and no one lives in. The innermost room belongs to Mr. Hai, deputy head of the cooperative. But the other day Mr. Hai asked permission from the factory to return to Tai Bin to visit his wife and children. Why is there anyone else here? After taking a moment to calm down, Kim sat on the corner of the bed, covered herself with the blanket, her heart pounding. Nonsense, where do you get ghosts in this era? The government is eliminating superstitious practices. As a progressive young man, Kim never believes in ghost stories. While idly thinking in her head, the rain gradually stopped. Kim forgot all about that, got up, grabbed a raincoat and prepared to go to the beach to check the pile of trash and boats. Looking at the old clock on the desk, it was now after 11 p.m., it was hard work, maybe I couldn't sleep all night. Thinking so, but as an exemplary young man, Kim was not afraid of wind and rain, put on a raincoat, locked the door carefully, and walked towards the beach. A little description of Mr. Kim's house so you can easily imagine. The row of communal houses has 4 adjacent houses, built on a gentle land near the foot of the hill, facing the rows of casuarina trees, bushes, and looking down. See. Behind the house is a large area of land for farming but still abandoned. The grass grows waist high, the land gently slopes up the hill. Continuing the story, Kim walked slowly to the beach. Even though the rain had stopped, it still stung her face. The raincoat was not enough to cover her body, Kim's head and shoulders were still wet. Taking long steps in the howling wind and rain, Kim felt a cold feeling on the back of her neck as if someone was watching her. Occasionally he turned his head and saw nothing. After calming himself down, it was just an illusion, the young man walked back to the beach. When she was only about 1 kilometer away from the turn to the beach, Kim suddenly stopped. Dimly in the flash of lightning, she saw a girl in a white shirt standing under a row of casuarinas. Kim squinted his eyes to look closely, but could not see the girl's face clearly, even though she was only standing about 100 meters away from him. He tried to call out, but in the howling of the wind and the rushing sound of the rain, his call seemed to be swallowed whole. Fumblingly climbed up the mound and then groped up the gentle ground leading up to the casuarina row. Kim was afraid that if the girl slipped down the hill, she would surely die. It was very difficult to find her way to the casuarina row. Suddenly, Kim stepped on a slippery rock and fell forward. Crawling up, raising his face, Mr. Kim seemed to see the white shirt flutter once and then disappear. Thinking that the girl had slipped down the hill, Kim said, "Ah," and then got up and ran. When he got there, looking down at the promontory, Kim didn't see anyone down there. Taking a closer look around, Mr. Kim sighed in relief and turned back. Suddenly, in the thick reed bush, he saw a handful of soil raised high, clearly made by human hands. Parting the reeds, he looked closely. It was indeed a grave. It seemed to have been abandoned for quite a long time because thick reeds had grown around the grave. On the grave was a small bowl of incense with a few sticks of incense, but there was no tombstone anywhere. While groping to observe, lightning suddenly exploded with a very loud bang sound, causing Kim to jump. In the flash of lightning, a white shadow of a woman appeared in the casuarina row, about 3 meters away from Mr. Kim and the grave. Mr. Kim jumped back, screaming without a sound, falling back with his mouth open, eyes wide open, but in the blink of an eye he couldn't see anything anymore. There was no one there. I strained my eyes to look closely. There were only rows of casuarinas and thick reed bushes, and a handful of lonely graves without a single person in sight. Taking a moment to regain his composure, Mr. Kim sat up, brushed off the mud and dirt on his body, then groped down, intending to ask everyone here about that abandoned grave. He bowed his head and walked all the way to the turn to the beach. As soon as he turned, he saw silhouettes of people on the beach, about a dozen people, both men and women. Running to the place, I saw people pulling ropes to tie the boats. Many boats had their ropes blown away by the wind. Luckily, no boat was swept out to sea, but many boats and bamboo boats were lost. Mr. Kim pulled the boat together, tied the ropes, and waded out to pull the nets and bamboo boats that were still nearby. It must be very difficult to be able to do those things in this situation of howling wind and pouring rain. The sky seemed to be displeased with people. While working, the rain came again, even more than in the afternoon. The rain was so strong that it was difficult to see the other person's face clearly. It took a while for Kim to recognize a few familiar people here. While collecting nets at the beach, Kim saw a girl about 2 meters away from her who was also struggling with 2 nets. The waves seemed to pull people away from the beach. Looking at the girl, it seemed like she could hardly stand anymore. Mr. Kim waded closer and pulled a net for the girl. Seeing the girl nodding in thanks, Kim was very happy. It seemed like the girl was trying to say something, but he couldn't hear her clearly. Wading a little closer, Mr. Kim only heard 2 echoes. Thank you, thank you. But strangely, the sound is very clear, but the sound is echoing and quite resonant, as if not affected at all by the wind. Suddenly a wave rushed in, causing Kim to stumble and slip, drinking several mouthfuls of salty sea water. Kim got up, clutching the blanket tightly, looked around and couldn't see the girl from before. Have the waves swept her out to sea? Terrified at the thought of that, he dived and groped, but found nothing. But at that moment he felt as if his legs were being wrapped around his body by some vines or moss. He was struggling but couldn't stand up. He kept diving and diving and diving again. Then he frantically half swam, half waded, struggled, and shouted loudly to everyone on the shore, but his screams were swallowed by the ocean waves and the storm. Struggling, trying to get it off, when he touched his leg, he only felt something slippery, slimy, covered with moss, but it was wrapped tightly around his leg. Every day he drowned more and more. Struggling and struggling with each wave as if trying to submerge her small body, Kim felt more and more exhausted. Choking on water, her chest aching, Kim seemed to fall into a daze. Feeling lethargic in the water, eyes blurred, ears ringing, Kim only vaguely noticed 2 bright spots of light deep in the turbid water. When his body lost all feeling, at that moment, a strong hand grabbed his hair, pulling him out of the water. Kim coughed and tried to get up, but the slippery object was still tightly wrapped around his leg. Those strong hands grabbed him tightly, then jerked so hard that both Kim and the other man fell backwards, the moss leaving his feet. The other person pulled him to shore. It took a long time for Kim to be able to breathe normally, but his whole body was still in pain. At this time, the storm had passed and the sky could dimly see people's faces clearly. Kim turned to the side to look at the benefactor who saved his life. Only then did he realize that it was an old man. He looked very sturdy, small but solid, with shiny black skin, looking like a bronze statue. He also turned to look at him and kindly asked, "Are you still tired?" Mr. Kim replied, "Yes, I feel better now, thank you very much." "Well, it's almost morning, my house is right here, come to my house to rest for a bit." Having said that, without waiting for Mr. Kim to answer, the old man helped him up and took him inside. His house is a small, shabby 4-level house located against a rocky shore. Once inside the house, Kim lay down on a bamboo bed in the middle of the house, unable to breathe. Kim looked at the house, which was also a shabby house like many other houses in this poor island area, but the strange thing was that on the wall there were many strange papers with symbols he had never seen before. The old man now came from behind the house, holding 2 bowls of steaming porridge in his hand, and gave 1 bowl to Mr. Kim without saying anything. 2 men, one old and one young, sat quietly eating a bowl of porridge. No one said anything. After a while, the old man turned to him and asked, "Are you from somewhere else? I've never seen him before, but he doesn't look like he's from this area." "Yes, I'm from Qianan, Haiphong. I've only been here for 1 month working for X factory." Then the old man pondered again. Suddenly he looked at his leg. His ankle was still red and bleeding from the thing that had been wrapped around it. He suddenly cried out, then looked closely at the wound. Then he asked him, "You had something wrapped around your leg just now, right?" "That's right, I couldn't get it out. The more I struggled, the tighter I got wrapped. I thought I was dead." "Thank you for saving your life." "It's okay, I've saved quite a few people like you. Why don't you live in the fishing village with the villagers instead of staying here alone?" The old man remained silent without saying a word, his face pensive, looking into the distance. Seeing that the old man did not answer, Kim did not feel comfortable asking. Waiting until it was completely light, he asked permission to leave. Before leaving, the old man pulled out an old dusty corrugated iron box from the corner of the room, rummaged around and pulled out a small yellow piece of paper with the words "No" written in red, telling him to remember to bring it with him, at least. "Is the next 3 days?" Kim had questions, but the old man said nothing. He said goodbye and left, filled with questions. Arriving at the beginning of the fishing village, he saw people milling around in the village as if something was going on. When he entered, he saw everyone chatting. The idea is that last night, while it was raining and windy, a fisherman named Kwong was lying with his wife and 2 children when he quickly got up, without saying a word. His eyes were white, his mouth was growling like he was crazy, and ran away. Leave the house, head straight towards Kai Sun Mountain, a dense hilly area where people say there are pythons, snakes, tigers and leopards in the forest. The wife chased her to the edge of the forest, lost sight of her, then ran home crying and called the villagers to look for her, but because the storm was raging, partly because it was dark in the middle of the night, the people agreed to wait until morning. Looking for. But at dawn this morning, a person rushed back, his face no longer bleeding, stammering that this morning he saw Mr. Kwong's body lying at the edge of the forest, under a banyan tree. The body was charred black, still there. Is smoking. When the wife heard that, she fainted, and the villagers gathered to go see what was going on. Kim also joined the group of people going into the forest. The road to the forest was extremely difficult. Last night's storm caused the hills to erode, and the previous trail was now completely covered with mud. Trees fell down, men had to walk and clear the road. When approaching the edge of the forest north of Kai Sun Mountain, a horrifying scene caught everyone's eyes, leaving everyone dumbfounded. Under the foot of an ancient banyan tree was a charred male corpse, limbs convulsed, still is smoking hotly. Many people who saw that horrifying scene could not bear it and vomited. Mr. Kim almost vomited and had to cover his mouth with his hand. It took a while for a few courageous adults to approach. The group also moved closer, and at this point Kim could see the corpse more clearly, a convulsed corpse, burned black, but the eyes were still wide open, white, and even more horrifying was that this person's mouth was still open. Just as before he died, he saw something that surprised him greatly. Everyone put his body in a hammock and carried it back to the village. When she returned to the village, she saw a mournful cry. The wife cried and wanted to run to hug her husband's body, but everyone stopped her. It's just the fault of two children, one 5 years old, one 4 years old, still playing innocently, not knowing the disaster that had struck the family. Looking at this scene, no one could hold back their tears. Several young men carried the man's body into the house and washed him before the burial ceremony. But the strange thing is that the corpse cannot close its mouth, nor can it close its eyes. Even now, after more than 20 years, those wide, white eyes still haunt Mr. Kim. At around 7 a.m., the coffin was brought in, just old boat planks that were poorly made. Everyone took Mr. Kwong's body into the coffin and took a discolored white towel to cover his face. A rudimentary altar was set up in a shabby house, the coffin lying in the middle of a small 4-level house. Next to the coffin, the wife kept passing out and waking up, and the neighbors also mourned the young man's painful death. An old man in the village stood up and said, "Now we need someone who knows how to recite sutras to help Kwong pass away. Tone and then quickly go and invite Mr. Lam, the shaman, to come here." Having said that, he pointed at 2 young men, who hurried towards the beach. After a while, the 2 boys returned with an old man. Mr. Kim realized that it was the old man who saved him that morning. It turned out that he was a shaman. He asked why there were so many strange papers in the house. Kim later learned that they were talismans. The old man hurriedly came over, asked everyone what was going on, then looked at the coffin, then he put on the old shirt hanging over his shoulder and walked towards the altar. After that, under his direction, each person took one thing with one hand and one hand, all of which were trinkets. Mr. Kim looked at them without understanding anything. Then he stood in front of the house, chanting Namo, holding a rosary in his hand, praying continuously. He read something a lot, but no one could hear it clearly. After a while it seemed like he was done. He walked towards the old man, sat down, took a sip of tea and said thoughtfully, "So Kwong died under the banyan tree on the northern edge of the mountain?" The old man replied, "It's so terrible, no one can help but be scared when looking at its dead body." Having said that, he described Mr. Kwong's corpse. Mr. Lam, the shaman, nodded and then became thoughtful again. He sat in silence for a while. No one dared to say anything, but after a while he spoke up. "So, Mr. Hoa, I say this. According to everyone's description, Mr. Kwong died at about 3 a.m., which is a very sacred hour. He died under a banyan tree on the edge of Kai Sun Forest, where ghosts and gods guarded him. That makes me worried. So it will be difficult for Mr. Kwong's soul to escape. He will still be kept alive by demons. It's difficult to say this. I have to go to that banyan tree to perform the ceremony, but at this rate I'm afraid." Speaking of this, he became thoughtful again. Then he said that at noon he would go into the forest alone, without anyone accompanying him. Having said that, after lunch he went alone into the forest with a bag of tools and a forest knife. Everyone at home waited anxiously, but it wasn't until about 2 hours later that he returned. Sitting and breathing for a while, he then raised his voice, a loud but very resonant and authoritative voice. "This is it, everyone. I went to that banyan tree just now. I also performed a ceremony to ask the gods, but 3 times I cast the hexagram and it didn't work. But there's one thing I'm worried about. The negative energy there is very heavy, very dark. The wind was strong, but there was no wind there. I'm afraid his death hasn't gone anywhere yet. But I'm wondering what terrible thing he saw that made him die without being able to close his eyes like that. I'm afraid that if he can't leave, he'll come back to harass everyone, just like before. An atmosphere of anxiety covers everyone. Mr. Hoa asked worriedly. So what can you do now? On this island, he is the only one who is the best, everyone can only look to him. Mr. Lamb frowned, shook his head, and thought for a moment. Later he replied, honestly, human strength is limited. I can only pray and ask the gods to help our village. I promise to do my best to not let the terrible things from before happen again. Everyone felt somewhat reassured when they heard that. The crowd also dispersed, and Kim also sadly returned home. By the time I got home, it was late afternoon and the sky was starting to get dark. Kim stripped off her clothes and left them in the house, wearing only a pair of sweatpants, and went to the back of the house to take a shower. Cold water poured into Kim's body, making Kim completely awake, feeling comfortable and refreshed. The wound on his leg was still painful and red, making him extremely uncomfortable. The wind was now blowing loudly, rustling the reeds behind the house, and the big jackfruit tree behind was also covered with leaves. While lost in thought, Kim was suddenly startled to listen, as if there was someone's footsteps or something moving in the reeds. She heard a very clear, rustling sound. He turned around and looked behind him. The reed grass is still rustling. Convincing himself that it was just an illusion because he was so tired, Kim poured water one last time and then went upstairs. Just as he bent down to scoop water, suddenly a cold hand was placed on his shoulder, a cold feeling running through Kim's body. But Kim's body was stiff at this time, he couldn't move even a finger. Kim felt something right behind him, but he couldn't turn his head. Suddenly, he felt a cold breath blowing on the back of his neck, then a vague voice seemed to come from other places so far away, but it echoes right in my ears. Come here, come here. Then Kim shivered, his limbs went limp. Opening her eyes, Kim felt her head ached. The sky was completely dark, all around him was covered in black. How long have I been unconscious? He asked himself, then tried to get up and crawl into the house. His body was sore and hot. When did the fever come? He tried to chew the package of raw instant noodles, but couldn't swallow it. Something that evening, maybe it was because I was delirious, he shuddered thinking back. But the cold feeling at that time was so real, how could it have been a dream? What is it? Is there something secret in this island area that everyone is so afraid of? What about the before story that Mr. Hoa and Mr. Lamb mentioned? There are so many mysteries. Kim plans to go down to the beach and ask Mr. Lamb tomorrow, when his fever subsides. In his delirium, he remembered his family, his hard-working mother, and his two younger sisters who were still at school age. He remembers his beloved street corner, where every afternoon he and the neighborhood youth divided into two sides to organize soccer matches with peeled leather balls. It's fun. Then he remembered Van, his little girlfriend. It's been more than a month since they've been apart, and he misses her very much. Since leaving the island, he has only received one letter from her, and he has also written 2 letters to her. He remembers his shoulder-length hair that always smelled of soapberry. He remembers his curled eyelashes. He remembers his mischievous smile. He remembers the times when they sat together. He remembers her appearance. Her figure is small, her hair is braided in a long pigtail down her back. The flickering oil lamplight reflected on the wall like a girl's image, making him miss her even more. That dim light reflected a figure of a girl sitting still, but seemingly looking intently at him. Van came to visit me. he thought to himself, feeling a little happy. Then the shadow grew longer, lengthened, stretched from the wall to cover a corner of the ceiling, then stretched out its thin arms. Not Van. Who is that? In delirium, sweat poured out like a shower, but Kim felt very cold, extremely cold. The shadow kept leaning forward, gradually covering a corner of the room. It stretched out its skinny arms, long and very thin, as if wanting to hug him completely. Then, on that shadow, a slit opened, as if the mouth was smiling, but the smile looked cold and sad. Kim wanted to get up and run away, but couldn't move her body and couldn't open her mouth. The closer the shadow came, the colder he felt the air. He was shivering, but his forehead was still sweating. It's approaching your bed. Very close. The shadow was at the end of the bed, slowly covering the wall, getting closer and closer to him. Then, it covered him. He couldn't move his body, his chest ached and felt heavy, his eyes blurred. I just feel cold, very cold. The wind blew through the crack in the door, making the atmosphere even more magical. Then a cold wind whistled past, the main door slowly opened. Outside, it was pitch black. The wind still howled plaintively as if crying. Run out of